The silence at Bramblehorn County's auction yard wasn't supposed to happen. Not on a Tuesday. Not when there was still money to be made and horses to be sold. But there she stood, barefoot, covered in dust, clutching a piece of torn saddle leather like it held her entire world together. 6 years old, maybe 7, with eyes that had seen too much and a voice that would soon cut through every soul in that sweltering yard. The sun hammered down on the cracked dirt as ranchers shifted uncomfortably in wooden bleachers, their shirts damp with sweat. Auctioneer Dobson's voice had been echoing sharp and practiced just moments before, calling out the next lot, a worn chestnut quarter horse, with ribs showing and eyes dull as river stones. Just another forgotten animal, with a faded brand pressed into his flank. Then everything stopped. The girl had wandered into the arena like a ghost materializing from the heat waves. Her brown dress sagged on her small frame, her boots were too big, and her matted hair clung to tear-streaked cheeks. But it wasn't her appearance that froze the crowd. It was the way she moved straight to that dying horse, the way he lifted his head slightly when she approached, as if recognizing something the rest of them couldn't see. "Please don't take him," she whispered, her small voice somehow carrying across the silent yard. "He saved me." Sheriff Cyrus Vane stepped down from the bleachers, dust swirling around his weathered boots. He was a man who'd learned that the hardest truths usually came wrapped in the smallest packages. Something about this moment felt like standing at the edge of a cliff he couldn't see the bottom of. "What's your name, darling?" he asked, gently stopping a few feet away. She looked up at him, her face streaked with sun and sorrow. "Wren Odessa Fields," she whispered. "He pulled me out of the fire at Hillgrave Ranch when it burned. No one came back for me." The words hit the crowd like a physical force. Gasps rippled through the stands. Hillgrave. That place had gone up in flames over a year ago. 2 adults dead. No mention of a child. The official reports had been filed. The case closed. The memories buried under paperwork and time. But here stood living proof that sometimes the most important things get missed in the smoke. Reverend Amos Tilley clutched his Bible tighter. Dr. Winnie Cray narrowed her eyes at the horse. She'd treated enough animals to recognize trauma when she saw it. Up in the shaded platform, Mayor Thatch Blavins felt something heavy settling in his chest, the weight of secrets no one was prepared to face. The chestnut horse hadn't moved from the girl's side. His legs trembled under his weight. His breathing was shallow, but every time Wren shifted, he shifted too, an old soldier still guarding what mattered most. That faded R brand on his flank suddenly meant something different to everyone watching. Sheriff Vane studied the girl's face, really looked at her. The dust, the fire, the loss. It was all there in her eyes, written in a language that didn't need translation. There would be questions, paperwork, procedures. But standing in that arena, watching a dying horse find strength he shouldn't have had, Cyrus knew he was witnessing something that couldn't be explained away or filed under routine. "Did you say Hillgrave, child?" Reverend Tilley called from the rail, his voice gentle but urgent. "The fire that took Thomas and Maggie Hillgrave. They were said to have no children." "I'm not their child," Wren replied, her voice catching like a dry twig. "They found me after my mama passed. Miss Maggie said I could stay forever, said I was home now." Her eyes shimmered as she looked down at the horse. When the fire came, they were gone. But he wasn't. He broke the gate, got me out, took me into the canyon. He never left me. The silence that followed was the kind that changes things. Thick, weighted, full of uncomfortable truths. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. This wasn't just about a lost girl and a dying horse anymore. This was about a town being forced to look at what they'd missed, what they'd chosen not to see, and what happens when the past refuses to stay buried in official reports and tidy explanations. In that moment, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the auction yard, everyone present understood they were about to discover just what kind of people they really were. The town of Bramblehorn had always prided itself on order. Clean records, clear answers, and proper procedures. But as Sheriff Cyrus Vane stared at Wren Odessa Fields standing beside that broken-down horse, he realized order was about to become a luxury they couldn't afford. because sometimes the truth doesn't come with paperwork. Mayor Thatch Blevins stepped forward, his political instincts kicking in even as his conscience wrestled underneath. "Now, Sheriff, we need to think this through carefully," he said, his voice measured but tight. "We can't just take a child's word without verification." From the crowd, a gruff voice cut through the tension. "How do we even know she's telling the truth?" It was Roy Breeden, one of the older ranchers, arms crossed and suspicion written across his weathered face. Could be some runaway making up stories for sympathy. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the stands, hesitant but present. That kind of doubt spreads fast in small towns, especially when people are scared of admitting they might have been wrong about something important. But Dr. Winnie Cray was already crouched beside the horse, her experienced hands moving along his scarred legs with gentle precision. She looked up at the crowd, her voice cutting through the whispers like a blade through silk. "He's got fire scarring," she announced, "and a dislocated hip that healed wrong, likely from carrying something heavy through rough terrain." She paused, letting the implications settle. "You can doubt the girl if you want, but this horse's body tells a story that matches every word she said." The truth hung in the dusty air, uncomfortable and undeniable. Wren didn't flinch at the suspicion surrounding her. Instead, she looked up at the men judging her with eyes far too old for her years. "You don't have to believe me," she said quietly. "But he knows, he remembers. He kept me warm in the canyon, brought me water even when he was hurt. If I'm lying, why would he still stay by me?" The chestnut gelding, as if understanding her words, let out a long breath and leaned closer to her. His body trembled with exhaustion, but his loyalty was unshakable. That question hung heavy in the afternoon heat. Unanswered, challenging. Sheriff Vane felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He'd been lawman in Bramblehorn for 12 years, and he'd learned to read people the way others read newspapers. But standing there watching that little girl and her dying horse, he knew this moment would define more than just their fate. "We searched that ranch top to bottom," Mayor Blevins said, his voice carrying a defensive edge. "There were no signs of another soul." "Then we didn't search hard enough," Cyrus replied, his words sharp enough to cut glass. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. No one liked being reminded of their failures, especially when those failures had eyes and a name, and stood barefoot in front of them asking for nothing more than the right to exist. Reverend Amos Tilley stepped closer to the rail, his weathered face soft with understanding. "The question shouldn't be whether she belongs here," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd buried half the town's dead and married the other half. "The question is what kind of people we are if we send her away after what she's survived." But even his words might not be enough. Not when fear was louder than faith. That night, Sheriff Vane didn't sleep. The image of Wren standing in that arena haunted every corner of his mind, her small hands clutching that piece of saddle leather like it contained her entire world. By morning, he was at the courthouse, thumbing through dusty files and fire reports from Hillgrave Ranch. Nothing, no mention of a child, no emergency contacts, no proof she'd ever existed in the eyes of the law. Mayor Blevins called an emergency meeting before noon. Around the scarred oak table in the town hall sat Cyrus, Reverend Tilley, Dr. Cray, and 2 members of the County Child Services Board. The air was thick with tension and the weight of decisions that would change lives. "We can't just let emotion rule here," Blevins said, his voice stern but betraying an underlying uncertainty. "Without records, we've got a mystery, and Bramblehorn doesn't need more mysteries right now." Cyrus leaned forward, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. "And if she's not lying, if that horse really did save her, and that girl survived alone in the hills, while no one came looking, and now she's back, and all we're doing is trying to erase her again." His words landed like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples of guilt through everyone at that table. The younger of the 2 child services agents, a woman named Connie Park, flipped through a thin folder. "She's not in any system," she said quietly. "No school records, no birth certificate on file here. But that doesn't mean she's a fraud, just that she's been missed, or hidden." She closed the folder with gentle finality. We can't leave her in limbo. Back at the auction yard, the chestnut gelding lay under the shade of a tin-roofed shelter. Dr. Cray checked his vitals again. He was fading. The trauma, starvation, and years of neglect had taken their toll. Yet the moment Wren entered the pen, his ears perked and his head lifted slightly. She knelt beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. I named him Harlan, she whispered to no one in particular. After the hill, so he'd never forget where we came from. The irony wasn't lost on anyone watching. A horse named for remembering, in a town that had chosen to forget. As word spread through Bramblehorn, people began showing up at the stable. Some brought grain, others brought blankets, a few brought judgment, and some brought both. But one thing became clear with each passing hour. The longer Wren stayed, the more she became a mirror, and not everyone liked what they saw reflected back at them. The tension that had started in that dusty arena was spreading through the town like wildfire, forcing everyone to choose sides in a battle between what was convenient and what was right. And time was running out for both the girl and the horse who'd saved her life. By the next morning, Harlan couldn't stand. His legs buckled when he tried, and the sound of him falling to the hay-covered ground echoed through the barn like a gunshot to the heart. Dr. Winnie Cray knelt beside him, her weathered hands trembling as she checked his breathing. For a woman who'd delivered foals and put down horses that had lost their will to fight, her voice cracked when she spoke. He's shutting down, she told Sheriff Vane, her fingers pressing gently against the horse's ribcage. The only thing keeping him going is her, and I don't know how much longer that'll be enough. Wren sat cross-legged in the straw beside Harlan, one small hand resting on his neck, feeling each labored breath like it was her own. She hadn't cried, not once since that first day in the arena. It was as if every tear had already been spent in the fire that had taken everything else from her. That afternoon, the town council gathered under the eaves of the old chapel. It wasn't an official meeting, not on paper, but every chair was filled. The sky had turned the color of bruised lavender, and dust swirled low across the fields as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Mayor Thatch Blavin stood at the front, his hat in his hands, his eyes heavier than they'd been in years. We've got a situation that doesn't fit clean in any rulebook, he began. I figure before we act, we best hear the people. But the people were split down the middle like a struck log. Some argued that Wren needed structure, a foster home, school, clean clothes, and regular meals. Others insisted she'd already survived more than most adults and had earned the right to stay, especially with Harlan hanging on by nothing more than love and stubbornness. Roy Breeden stood up, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd worked this land for 40 years. Rules exist for a reason, he said. We can't just bend them because our hearts are pulling us in different directions. But then Sheriff Cyrus Vane stepped forward, and his words burned with the kind of conviction that comes from carrying too much guilt for too long. You all know what we missed the first time, he said, his voice steady but sharp as a blade. That fire at Hillgrave. We didn't ask enough questions. We didn't search far enough. We let a little girl disappear because it was easier to believe she wasn't there. He paused, letting that truth settle like dust on everyone present. Now we've got a second chance. Don't pretend it's anything else. Back at the barn, Wren didn't know about the meeting. She stayed by Harlan's side, singing an old hymn that Maggie Hillgrave used to hum in the mornings, soft and slow, barely more than a whisper threading through the evening air. Harlan's eyes opened just enough to find hers, and she smiled faintly. I'm still here, she whispered, and I won't leave, not even if they try. Dr. Cray stood a few feet away, swallowing the lump in her throat. She'd seen plenty of animals fight death, but this one, this broken, trembling soul was fighting for something bigger than survival. He was fighting for love, for purpose, for the promise he'd made to a little girl in the middle of a fire. He won't go until she's safe, Winnie said quietly, almost to herself. Damn stubborn thing. As the sun began to set, footsteps approached the barn. Sheriff Vane stood in the doorway, hat in hand, the weight of the town's decision heavy on his shoulders. Wren, he said softly, can you come outside a moment? There's something I need to tell you. Her fingers froze on Harlan's mane. She turned slowly, her eyes searching his face for meaning, for permission to hope or prepare for heartbreak. When the horse blinked just once, slowly, deliberately, she stood, Outside, a quiet hush had fallen over the yard. Several townspeople stood in a loose circle, avoiding each other's eyes like children who'd been caught stealing candy. The air felt electric, charged with the kind of tension that comes before lightning strikes. Sheriff Vane knelt to face her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. There was a vote, he said carefully. Some folks think you should go with the state. Let them find you a home. Some think your home's right here. He paused, and in that silence, Wren's entire future hung in the balance. It was close. Wren, real close. She didn't answer right away. Her face barely moved, but her fingers began to twist the edge of that piece of saddle leather she always carried, the only thing left from before the fire, before the loss, before the world had tried to forget she existed. The silence around her was a verdict in itself. Too heavy, too long, too cruel for a girl who had already lost more than most people could bear in a lifetime. "If I go," she whispered, her voice so small it barely disturbed the evening air. "Who's going to tell Harlan?" That question hit every adult present like a physical blow. Because in those 7 words, a 6-year-old girl had just shown them what real love looked like. Not the kind that asks for something in return, but the kind that worries about others even when your own world is crumbling. Mayor Thatch Blevins cleared his throat, stepping forward. His voice wasn't as strong as it had been earlier in the chapel, and his hands shook slightly as he spoke. "The vote was tied," he said, looking at the ground instead of her eyes. "But the final say came to me." He lifted his head, and for the first time in years, Mayor Blevins looked like a man who remembered why he'd wanted to serve people in the first place. "I chose to let you stay," he said simply. "You have people here now, Wren, and you won't be forgotten again." The relief didn't come all at once. Wren didn't cry or smile or even move. She just stood there, processing it, her small chest rising and falling with quiet disbelief. Then, without a word, her feet moved on their own, running back toward the barn, dirt flying beneath her as the adults watched in respectful silence. Inside, Harlan hadn't moved. But when she dropped to her knees beside him, his ears twitched and he lifted his head just slightly. "I told you," she said breathlessly, pressing her face into his mane. "We're safe now." And in that moment, as if those words reached into some place deeper than muscle or bone, the old horse gave a long, low exhale. Not pain, not fear, but something closer to peace. The sound of a promise finally kept, a duty finally complete. Dr. Winnie Cray stepped forward from the shadows, her voice cracking with emotion. "He waited," she said, to no one in particular. "All this time, he waited to know she wouldn't be taken again." Sheriff Cyrus Vane stood quietly beside her, hands on his hips, watching the girl and horse with a mixture of reverence and guilt. There would still be battles ahead, papers to sign, arrangements to make, questions to answer. But in that moment, something fundamental had shifted. The town had chosen to remember, and Harlan could finally rest. The next morning, the barn smelled of rain-soaked hay and new beginnings. It had rained lightly overnight, a rare blessing in Bramblehorn, and the soft patter on the tin roof had lulled Wren into the first real sleep she'd had in weeks. When she opened her eyes, her body was still curled beside Harlan's, her hands resting on his shoulder. For a terrifying second, she couldn't feel him breathe. Then came a shallow rise of his chest, then another. He was still there, still fighting. Dr. Winnie Cray arrived early, a thermos of coffee in one hand and her worn veterinary bag in the other. "He made it through the night," she said softly to Sheriff Vane, who leaned against the barn post like a man keeping vigil. "I won't lie, he's still fragile, but the will to survive, that's stronger in him now than it's ever been, and that's her doing." Outside, the mood in town had shifted like weather after a storm. Some still whispered in corners. Folks like Roy Breeden, who didn't like that rules had bent for one little girl and her horse. But others had started showing up with quiet gestures that spoke louder than words. A box of groceries left on the church steps, a bag of oats by the barn door, a donated coat hanging on the fence post. Wren watched it all from a distance, unsure how to feel about people suddenly remembering she existed. At the diner, Reverend Amos Tilley spoke to a small crowd over black coffee and biscuit crumbs. What that girl reminded us, he said, his voice low and steady, is that love doesn't follow paperwork. It shows up when it's needed, not when it's scheduled. And that horse, he remembered her when the world didn't. Heads nodded, eyes lowered. No one argued. Back at the barn, Sheriff Vane helped Wren carry water to Harlan. The horse's steps were shaky, but for the first time in days, the old gelding tried to stand. His legs trembled like saplings in a storm, and he rose halfway before pausing, sweat breaking along his shoulders. Wren gasped and ran to his side, steadying him the only way she knew how, with her voice. "You can do it, boy. You already saved me once. I'm not going anywhere now." And as if those words reached into some place deeper than muscle or bone, Harlan pushed himself up, shaky but upright. Standing, the barn filled with the kind of silence that comes before miracles, then quiet awe. Dr. Cray covered her mouth. Sheriff Vane lowered his hat in respect, and Wren smiled, not the kind of smile that comes from joy, but the deeper kind that comes from survival, from knowing that sometimes the most broken things find ways to heal each other. A week passed, and with each sunrise, Harlan stood a little taller. His ribs were still visible, but strength was returning to his legs. The wound in his hip still made him limp, but there was purpose in every step now. Wren brushed him every morning, whispering stories from the days before the fire, of Maggie Hillgrave, humming in the kitchen, of Thomas reading scripture on the porch, of nights spent under the stars with only Harlan for company. The past, once buried in smoke and silence, now spilled gently back into the world like water finding its level. Sheriff Vane stopped by the barn more often than he cared to admit. Sometimes he brought grain. Other times he just stood with his arms crossed, listening to Wren talk to the horse. He wasn't good with children, never had been. But something in the girl's calm, stubborn spirit reminded him of someone he'd once lost. And though he never said it out loud, he found himself checking the barn doors last thing every night, making sure she was still there, still safe. Mayor Blevins kept his distance publicly, but when he passed Wren in the street one morning and saw her walking hand in hand with Reverend Tilly, he tipped his hat and kept walking. Some things, he figured, were bigger than politics. At Sunday's service, the pews were fuller than usual. Wren sat in the front row with Reverend Tilly, wearing a clean dress donated by the pastor's wife and a pair of polished black boots that still looked too big for her feet. When the choir began singing Blessed Assurance, she listened with her eyes closed but didn't sing. She didn't need to. Her presence was its own testimony. Outside after the service, Roy Breeden approached. The old rancher took off his hat, cleared his throat, and extended a small cloth bag to Wren. "Oats," he said, without looking her in the eye. For the horse, Wren accepted the bag without a word, but Sheriff Vane saw her smile barely twitch at the corner of her lips. Even the hardest hearts, it seemed, could be softened, if not by reason, then by a child's unwavering faith that the world could be better than it had been. Spring came late that year, but when it did, it settled softly over Bramblehorn, in the fields, in the trees, and in the eyes of those who had watched Wren and Harlan rise from the ashes. The barn had been cleaned and repainted by volunteers. A wooden nameplate was nailed to the stall. Harlan, survivor. Folks from neighboring counties had heard the story, and they came by on Sundays just to glimpse the chestnut gelding, who had chosen to live when dying would have been easier. Wren had grown, not in size, but in spirit. She moved through the town like someone born there, though everyone knew better. At the diner, she helped fill sugar jars and wipe tables. At the church, she lit candles before service. And in the afternoons, she sat with Harlan beneath the cottonwood trees, reading aloud from a Bible that Maggie Hillgrave had once given her, the edges singed by fire, but the words still whole. Sheriff Vane filed every document he could find to secure legal guardianship. It wasn't official yet, but no one questioned where Wren belonged anymore. On quiet evenings, she would ride Harlan slowly around the edge of the pasture, careful of his limp, patient with his pace. Every step he took was a quiet defiance of the pain he'd endured, and every time she dismounted, she whispered, "We did it." as if reminding both of them that survival had become something greater than mere escape. As the sun set one evening, painting the fields in hues of gold and crimson, Sheriff Vane stood at the fence line watching the two of them. Wren had taken off her boots and stood barefoot in the grass, her dress fluttering in the breeze. Harlan nudged her gently with his nose, and she laughed, a soft, clear sound that cut through the quiet like a hymn. For the first time in a long while, the town of Bramblehorn felt whole. Not perfect, not completely healed, but whole in the way that matters most, the kind of whole that's earned through truth, pain, and second chances. And as the stars blinked into the night sky, Wren leaned against her horse and whispered words that carried across the evening air like a prayer finally answered. "We're not just safe anymore, we belong." In that moment, everyone who heard her knew she was right. They all belonged, the girl, the horse, and the town, that had learned to remember what it meant to choose love over convenience, courage over comfort, and hope over fear. Sometimes the most important rescues happen when broken things save each other.